Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 103rd Samil commemoration event. March 1st, 1919 was the birth of the Korean independence movement, which laid the foundation for a free Republic of Korea. That movement was as significant to Korea as the Declaration of Independence and the founders are to the United States. Korean Americans played a key role in the movement, which we are celebrating and building on today. Greetings to our audience in the United States, Korea, and worldwide. My name is Andrew Seol, and I serve as the Executive Vice President of the Alliance for Korea United, a US-based NGO hosting today's event. The theme of today's program is Inheriting the Legacy of Korean American Leadership. Experts will present perspectives from the unique Korean American pioneering efforts of the Korean independence movement in the United States and its global impact. I would like to introduce Mr. Richard Lee, President of Alliance for Korea United USA, to bring welcoming remarks.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this 103rd Samil Movement commemoration. We would like to recognize the Korean American pioneers' activities and contributions to the Korean independence movement and share this awareness broadly. Understanding this movement is vitally important, not just for its historical value, but as a foundation for our ongoing essential role in supporting freedom for all Koreans on the peninsula. Recognizing the significance of the Korean independence movement and the vital contributions of Korean American pioneers in 1919, Korean Americans have consistently commemorated this March 4th anniversary as a special day of recognition. Korean Americans in the US carried out a remarkable public awareness campaign building support for the Korean cause among American people who knew almost nothing about the nation of Korea. These Samil pioneers built this campaign on Korean human rights and freedom issues that were based on Christian ideals and America's founding principles. The US-ROK partnership remains a vital backbone for peace and security in Northeast Asia and is critically important for addressing the current challenges on the Korean Peninsula. Korean Americans, with the deep roots on both sides of the Pacific, are uniquely called and qualified to support and strengthen this essential partnership. Today's program features expert presentations from the historic Samil centers in California, Philadelphia, and New York, while key campaigns were launched by the independence pioneers. You are invited to appreciate and catch the spirit of these historic campaigns through these presentations. As the work remains unfinished, we are invited by our courageous predecessors to continue the movement until freedom is firmly established for all the people on the peninsula. Please enjoy the program.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee just referred to today's program, which will be in two parts. The first will feature presentations highlighting Korean American history, focus on three civilian leaders based in three key locations and in the United States. Major Samil activities were generated by pioneers in Central California, Philadelphia, and New York. To begin our discussion, I'd like to introduce our first expert, Dr. Marn J, who will give the historical perspective of early Koreans in Central California. Dr. Cha is a professor Emeritus in Political Science at California State University, Fresno, and president of the Central California Korean Historical Society. He authored the book, Koreans in Central California, 1903 through 1957, a study of settlement and transnational politics.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to a very significant event that took place in Korean history. That is, for 1,000 years, the historically we say 5,000 years of Korean history, on and off, most of the time, Korea has been a tributary state to China. That means that it has lived and functioned pretty much as a country paying tribute to China right next door, the most dominant power. But what China did to Korea, however, you pay a variety of gifts and tributes to Chinese emperor, but China left Korea pretty much as an autonomous state to function on its own, keeping their own culture, language, and so on. So they have never felt that they were colonized country, although they looked up to China for diplomacy, protection, and so on. This has radically changed in 1910, when Japan, as an industrial power, rising industrial power in East Asia, after Japanese Meiji Restoration in 1868, which means in practical terms is that Japan began to open up itself to Western science and technology, has rapidly developed in its industrialization, and as well as a military power. And Japan had ambition to expand toward the China, really, dominant power. To do that, to seize Korea first as a bridge to China, which it formally did in 1910. 1910, between Korean Kingdom and Japanese Empire, concluded a treaty whereby Korea has become a part of Japan, simply put, although it's a colony. So Korea as such was wiped off the map. It's gone. It has become part of Japan. This shocked the Koreans to the bone, because even under China, they have never felt their territory was occupied by foreign power. But in Japanese annexation case of Korea, it was formally declared that Korea as such shall no longer exist, as it has become, she has become part of Japan. For about 10 years later, and this was done in 1910, in the meantime, First World War has come to an end in 1917, and the end of First World War was engineered by United States, particularly a morally driven President Woodrow Wilson. Upon conclusion of the First World War, Wilson declared an important policy stance to the world, that is, to keep this, to to keep the world safe for democracy. That was his motto. And he presented 14 points to the League of Nations. Of that 14 points, there was a clause for self-determination of all oppressed people. Now, this has spread throughout the world. And many countries then, they were seized under imperialism and colonialism, got all excited, including India under Gandhi, Korea, and then countries in Africa. And Koreans watched very carefully, and this Wilson's call for self-determination of all oppressed people have galvanized Koreans to declare themselves independent, consistent with the Wilson's idea of self-determination. And they have planned it, a massive resistance to Japanese occupation. And that took place March 1st, 1919. The legacies of March 1st, 1919 are twofold. First, it has given to Koreans a national crisis at which they became truly nationalistic. So it has developed Korean nationalism for the world to watch. And then second, consistent with the idea of self-determination, Korea shall become democracy, no longer monarchy, or go back to kingship. Now, Japanese occupiers brutally suppressed the demonstrators. Estimate is that the then Korean population, both south and north now divided by then one Korean population of about 20 million, out of which about 400,000 population took place in the March 1st resistance movement, which, by the way, not just took place one day, it lasted at least half year to year. As soon as you suppress movement in one place, and then it popped up another place, and so on. So Japanese police and gendarmes means military police, were busy hopping around the different areas. Whenever they suppressed and quieted it down one area, then another area popped up with a demonstration and so on. About 900 Korean folks were murdered and killed. And then about 40,000 were injured, and also same number were imprisoned. Now, then Koreans who couldn't stand the Japanese occupation, and also those who had ambition to study abroad, started to leave Korea. They left for Manchuria, China, and also Beijing and Shanghai to study abroad. And some, by the way, left for Japan to study in Japan. Many of them left for the United States as immigrants. And coincidentally, about this time, Hawaii, which then was US territory, needed laborers to work on Hawaii sugar plantation. And they asked the Korean king to send some Korean laborers to Hawaii. So between 1912 and 1915, 7,000 plus Koreans arrived in Hawaii. to work on sugar fields. Some of them transmigrated from Hawaii to west coast of the United States, primarily in California, state of Washington, then Iowa, and so on, to work primarily on California farm fields as farmer and laborers, and also as miners in Iowa and Colorado and so on. Then about 2,000 Koreans out of that 7,000 transmigrated to the West Coast. Of those 2,000 or so, first settlement was in Riverside, Southern California, to pick orange, harvest oranges. And then because of the frost and natural disaster, the orange farming did last only about several years and then had to close. And most of them moved to Central California, which is, we are referring to from north of Sacramento through Stockton and then the San Jose and Fresno, and then two most populous states for Koreans, or two small farm towns near Fresno, the south of Fresno. They are called, still, it's very active town, Dinuba and Ridley. And Dinuba is spelled D-I-N-U-B-A, and Ridley, R-E-E-D-L-E-Y. These two farm towns opened up to Korean laborers to pick up orange, apricot, grapes, strawberries, what locals call tree fruits. That's a fruit growing out of tree. And then later on, the rice farming developed north of Sacramento, which have drawn Koreans, Japanese, Indians, and so on. So these Koreans in Central California, they also heard and knew about March 1st massive uprising against the Japanese imperial occupiers in 1919. And the first year of March 1st anniversary, that is March 1st, 1920, year later, Koreans in Dinuba and Ridley banded together, and they decided to put up a great celebration of the bloody Declaration of Independence, which took place a year ago. Historically, the March 1st celebration or anniversary celebration that took place in Dinuba is the first and the only anniversary in Korean history, because the Koreans in Korea couldn't do anything about it because they were under Japanese watchful eyes, and technically they were living under Japanese rule. And then the Korean exiles spread in Manchuria and part of Far East Russia, and then Shanghai. In Shanghai, they established a provisional Korean government, that is a government in exile, in April 1919, but they were poorly organized. They didn't have funds to celebrate a year later. So what took place in Dinuba is the only one that had a formal celebration of the March 1st. Now, how did they celebrate? They were getting paid then 10 cents an hour as a laborer on a farm, and they were not, but they by no means they were well-to-do folks at all. They were just farm laborers, but they wanted to put up a big show, and they paraded the downtown area in 𝗪𝗪. They hired the jeeps and hired the horses, and also they hired the airplane. Now, how did the airplane come about? That again has to do with Koreans' rice farming up in Northern California. A Korean who farmed about 1,000 acres plus, then 10,000 later on, was a Kim Jong-Nim. He was called the Rice King because he was growing rice on a huge scale. And he put up the money to set up a Korean flight school. It's called the Willows, California, in Willows. It's a game farm place. The Willows Korean Aviation School in Willows. And he was training Korean pilots with the modern technology, with his wealth. And his idea was that to train Korean combat pilots who could confront Japanese occupiers in Korea. That was the idea behind it. Looking back, of course, it was daunting and perhaps impossible, but they were resolved that much. The pilot at that school was to fly over the parade route in 𝗪𝗪 on March 1st, 1920. And the plane came up to Fresno. But in those days, the plane, you shouldn't think of today's plane. It was a little better than the makeshift made plane. It required the pilot's feet to adjust and to use the brake. And although there's a motor running, and that day it was raining badly, and he came up to Fresno, which left only 12 nautical miles to reach 𝗪𝗪, but he didn't. But they publicized to the local newspapers that plane will be flying over parade route. So all neighbors showed up, and those are some of the pictures that I have shown, and parade route. But the newspaper reporter went up to Fresno to interview pilot, and then all those events are reported in the local newspaper, which is still I have a copy. And so what's the message that they had was that most of these Korean immigrants were Christians, because when sugar plantation owners started to recruit Korean immigrants from Korea to Hawaii, they approached American missionaries in Korea, because missionaries had under their flock a bunch of Koreans who got converted to Christianity. Now, those who were still steeped in Confucius beliefs and Taoism were not willing to leave the country, because they had to protect their ancestors' grave and so on. This is, again, you got to think of it's at the beginning of 20th century. So only those who are open to outside world were Christians. So most Christians were recruited and came to Hawaii. And so the Koreans in 𝗪𝗪 and Ridley, first thing they did was establishing churches. So church was an organization where you had a prayer session, religious session, but also political movement as well. And the rationale of the preachers was that freedom is God-given, which is an inherent part of the equality under message of the gospel and Jesus Christ. So somebody else taking away that freedom is something that we can ask God to help us take it back. And therefore, preaching at church, Korean independence was not contradictory, was not inconsistent with Christian message. In fact, they all passionately felt that. It is something that they can pray for and ask for the help of the divine help of Christian religion. So these Koreans were all resolved in helping the country, their homeland they left, become independent eventually, and then ask the Japanese imperialists to leave the country and give Koreans back freedom. So this March 1st movement was an important turning point for Koreans to be able to appreciate the concept of freedom first. And then second, if you love freedom, then political system you turn to is naturally democracy. And therefore, freedom and democracy became ingrained in Korean psyche and psychology from 1919 on. And from that point on, the idea of democracy again got reinforced when U.S. came to assist South Korea to stand on its own and develop to the degree it has now. And so the South Korean democracy and students' demand for democracy during the military dictatorship in Korea, all that democratic tradition and idea go back to March 1st, 1919 breakthrough. And that's why Koreans date the modern Korea from the time that Korean provisional government was established in Shanghai in April 1919 onward. And for Koreans immigrants in the United States, specifically in small town, farm town called 𝘓𝘓𝘨, was the place where they celebrated, remembered the first anniversary in the grandest manner possible in those days. And to keep this memory alive, I helped to establish Central California Korean Historical Society in 2002, right at the centennial anniversary of commemorative event of centennial event of Korean U.S. immigration. And if you come to 𝘓𝘓𝘨 and Ridley, we have monuments, and also 1/3 condensed replica of Korean Independence Gate, the original Independence Gate, which you can see in Westgate, Seodamun area in Seoul. We built 1/3 of that size, and that stands in Ridley downtown with American Korean flag flying left and right. And then right in front of the Independence Gate, we have 10 patriots monument standing, ranging from Seo-hyun Lee, Ahn Chang-ho, and so on, those who had to do with Ridley and Danube in those days. Because Koreans lived there, Korean independence activists did visit two farm towns quite often to raise money to wage their independence movement. And also, these two places were instrumental in raising money to establish a Korean provisional government in Shanghai in 1919. Thusly, for the Korean descendants, and as well as others, remembering how first year anniversary of independence movement of 1919 was carried on among Koreans in Danube is very important to maintain their identity, to know their roots in America. Now, let me end this one with an important note, however. Our idea of having established and erected monuments and historical landmarks in region Danube, which we have about 10 of them if you come to here, is not to really raise Korean nationalism in exclusion of all others. I'm an internationalist and humanist. What that means is that we got to develop our identity with an idea that we should include everyone and live with everyone and learn how to love humanity. Now, in order to do that, you got to know who you are first. And you get confused if you don't know your sense of being yourself. And so history is important in developing and maintaining your sense of identity from which or from where you can extend your humanity and your compassion and your love to your fellow human beings, no matter what color they are, what nationality they are. We are to live together in the same boat with compassion, with love. And so I want the audience to understand that this not to encourage Korean nationalism in its exclusive sense, but in an inclusive sense to develop identity from which to extend their humanity to all races, to all friends. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Cha. We appreciate your impressive presentation. It gives us a clear understanding of the historical background of Korea and Korean Americans in the US at that time. Next, we will now turn our focus to another iconic leader of the Samil efforts here in America, Philip Jaisohn. To better understand his work and legacy, we would like to feature a video presentation shown previously at the Philip Jaisohn House. This video was produced together with KBS. Let's take a look.
For Korean immigrants struggling to adapt to a foreign life, and for patients who receive free medication from the Philip Jaisohn Memorial Foundation in Philadelphia. Dr. Philip Jaisohn is not merely a legend, but a lived experience. Famous as the founder of a newspaper, The Independent, Independence Club, and Independence Gate, Dr. Jaisohn is still revered as a pioneer of modernization, exponent of democracy, and champion of the independence of Korea. What does Dr. Philip Jaisohn teach us today through a variety of traces he left in history, ranging from the 𝗪𝗪𝗄 to Japanese occupation and liberation? On December 4th, 1884, radical reformists staged the 𝗪𝗪𝗄 to fight for reformation during the opening ceremony of 𝗂정국, the first post office where high officials and foreign diplomats attended. The leaders were Philip Jaisohn, Kim Ok-kyun, Park Yong-hyo, and So Kwang-bum. The 𝗪𝗪𝗄 was short-lived, collapsing in 3 days, and this event changed Jaisohn's life forever. The Korean government sought to arrest Jaisohn and his colleagues, but they could manage to escape through the port city of Incheon and then to Japan. In 1885, they boarded the Empire of China in Yokohama and arrived in the United States after a 2-week voyage. The only thing that they carried was a recommendation letter written by a missionary.
우리는 아는 사람도 없고 돈도 없고 언어도 통하지 않으며 이 나라 풍습에도 익숙지 못했다. 이처럼 생소한 곳에서 우리는 온갖 고초를 맛보지 않을 수 없었다. 우리 세 사람은 태평양의 거친 파도에 밀려 캘리포니아 해안에 표착한 쓰레기같이 외롭고 가엾어 보이는 존재들이었다.
At that time, the American press portrayed them as emigres from the land of hermits. They reported that Jaisohn and his colleagues had enjoyed a splendid life, even though they were living in misery in a foreign city. News coverage was so sympathetic as to describe them as active followers of progressive causes rather than as passive victims of misfortunes. Jaisohn got a job in a furniture store and worked very hard while receiving low pay. During the day, he delivered advertising leaflets, and at night he studied using a self-made dictionary. He attended church every Sunday in order to learn English and Christianity. Jesus Christ was his only comfort. It was at church that Jaisohn met a coal magnate and philanthropist, John Wells Hollenbach, who encouraged and supported Jaisohn in his education. One and a half years later, since he had arrived in San Francisco, Jaisohn left for Wilkes-Barre, a small town near Philadelphia. In 1886, Philip Jaisohn entered the Harry Hillman Academy, a private college preparatory high school that Mr. Hollenbach founded, and sat on the board of directors. It was during this period that he changed his name from his original Korean name, Seo Jae-pil, reversing and anglicizing the characters to Philip Jaisohn. According to his academic transcripts, Jaisohn earned outstanding grades. His dream could not stop there. He went to Washington, D.C. and worked in the Army Surgeon General's library. translating Chinese and Japanese medicine books into English, he became interested in medicine. Jaisohn then applied and was admitted to the medical department of Columbia University, now known as George Washington University. He became the first Korean to earn a medical degree from an American institution in 1892. Along the way, he also became the first Korean to obtain U.S. citizenship in 1890. At the age of 30, Dr. Jaisohn met an American woman, Muriel Armstrong, and married her in 1894. Muriel Armstrong was from a renowned family. Considering that newspapers reported his wedding ceremony, we can imagine that he was already well known in the U.S. at that time. His wedding was the first comfortable settlement after 10-year life as a political refugee. But Korea was waiting for his return. In the meantime, the political climate in Korea was becoming gradually favorable to enacting modern reforms. Freed from the charge of treason, Dr. Jaisohn returned to his homeland and initiated various reform activities. Working as an advisor to the Privy Council, he set to publish The Independent, the first newspaper printed in Korean and English. In the first issue, Dr. Jaisohn emphasized making fair judgments on all social issues without any political bias. Dr. Jaisohn also made the newspaper reading easy for everyone by using the Korean language character set instead of the complex Chinese language, to ensure that it can serve as a forum for public opinion and debate. Relating to his poignant experience of the Caption coup, he realized that no revolution could succeed without educating and mobilizing people. At the same time, Dr. Jaisohn organized public meetings and lectures to instill the spirit of progress and reform in the general public. To encourage the reform movement, he organized a student association, 𝘓𝘂𝘁, at 𝗵𝗵𝗀 Academy. He also founded the Independence Club and constructed the Independence Gate to declare the Korean people's will for independence throughout the world. As many as 6,000 people gathered to celebrate the groundbreaking of the Independence Gate. Teaching that national sovereignty lies in people's hands, Dr. Jaisohn strived to cultivate democratic and critical thinking. The Independence Club, originally formed to build the Independence Gate, at first allied itself with the government and subsequently developed into a populist organization. As people from all walks of life increasingly showed support for the club, Dr. Jaisohn accused imperialistic nations of conspiring to occupy Korea. He was not also reluctant to suggest measures to constrain King's absolute rights. Through the newspaper editorials and public speeches, Dr. Jaisohn incriminated Russia and Japan, which were becoming increasingly influential in the international scene. In retaliation, they attempted to exile Dr. Jaisohn back to the U.S.
일본의 의사에 반대하는 행동을 하는 사람은 누구나 암살해버리겠다고 강력하게 암시했다. 그들은 나를 독약처럼 미워한다.
In the end, Korea became prey of Japanese imperialism. Dr. Jaisohn worked in the Wistar Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. He seems to have worked on publishing medical books. In 1904, he started a printing and stationery business in Wilkes-Barre and Philadelphia. The business was so successful he employed 70 workers. In those days, family life was also hopeful and peaceful with his 2 daughters. But before long, he had to engage in politics again. On March 1st, 1919, Korean people staged a nationwide uprising when Japanese military occupation reached its culmination. Japan oppressed the non-violent resistance with military forces, resulting in a massive number of casualties. 7,500 were dead and 16,000 were injured for the first 3 months. The Samil movement created a worldwide sensation. Foreign press covered it as big news. On receiving the news, Koreans in the U.S. began to mobilize. Philip Jaisohn organized the first Korean Congress with Ri Seung-man and Jong-Hak, and they marched through downtown of Philadelphia. The participants numbered as many as 150. Given the fact that only 1,000 Koreans resided in North America at that time, it was a remarkable turnout. Even though the vast majority of Koreans lived in the West Coast, the Korean Congress was held in Philadelphia because they regarded Philip Jaisohn as their guiding beacon.
30년 전 인천항을 떠날 때 한인들이 죽은 백성인 줄 알았습니다. 그러나 1919년 3.1 운동을 보니 산 백성인 줄 알았고 이런 백성은 반드시 자유독립을 하고 말 것으로 믿었습니다. 그래서 내가 연설도 하고 선전 사업 활동을 시작하게 됐습니다.
During the first Korean Congress held for 3 days from April 14th, participants discussed various ways to organize Koreans in order to create international awareness of the Samil movement. In an effort to raise the agenda of Korean independence, Dr. Philip Jaisohn established the Korean Information Bureau and printed a periodical, Korea Review. Several chapters of the League of Friends of Korea were also organized throughout the U.S. The League submitted petitions to the U.S. government for the cause of Korea and held public meetings. The League succeeded in winning American public opinion. Even Sidney Gulick, who was favorable to Japan, was affected by the League and sent a letter protesting Japan's oppression governance. In 1921, the Disarmament Conference was convened in Washington, D.C. The United States, Great Britain, France, Japan, and Italy were among the major stakeholders. Dr. Jaisohn believed it was a golden opportunity for furthering the cause of Korea. He organized a Korean delegation and sent a plea to the Secretary of State, Charles Hughes, claiming the legitimacy of Korean independence. The focal point of his activities was the press. From the 1920s to the 1940s, he actively contributed articles to many newspapers and magazines, such as the 𝗏𝗏𝘅, 조선일보, 신민, and 신한민보, emphasizing the importance of Korean people's unity. In doing so, he had to sacrifice his private property and whole life. The Korean Commission to America and Europe discontinued financial subsidization for Korean Information Bureau. Huge expenses went into maintaining journals, meetings, and legal assistance from top lawyers. Coupled with economic depression, his business went bankrupt and his house was pledged. To support his family was extremely difficult. Dr. Jaisohn had to enter medical school again at the age of 62. In spite of his age, he conducted a great deal of research and published 5 journal articles. At that time, he suffered tuberculosis due to fatigue. His wife also passed away. At last, Korea regained independence in 1945, and many overseas political leaders returned. Dr. Jaisohn also came back due to the strong request by another leader, Kim Kwi-shik, who admired him. A large crowd welcomed his return. Korean people expected him to play a critical role in rebuilding a new nation. In particular, they eagerly waited for a figure who would unite people amidst political fragmentation. Some people claim that Dr. Jaisohn should replace Ri Sung-man to be the first president. But Dr. Jaisohn did not have such political desires. His activities remained in the non-political realm. As an old man, I don't have any ambition. High status or an honorable position is meaningless to me. My prime interest is to educate people. Korea was divided into 2 separate nations. As Ri Sung-man was elected as the first president of South Korea, Dr. Jaisohn decided to leave Korea. Perhaps he intended to avoid further political turmoil. Dr. Jaisohn went to the U.S., leaving behind his divided homeland. Betraying his earnest wishes, the Korean War broke out in 1950.
합하면 조선이 살 테고 만일 나뉘면 조선이 없어질 것이. 조선이 없으면 남방 사람도 없어지는 것이고 북방 사람도 없어지는 것이니. 그니 왜 죽을 일을 할 묘리가 있습니까? 살 도리대로 하시오.
In the following year, Dr. Philip Jaisohn passed away, leaving his spirit as a legacy to the Korean American community. In 1977, the Korean government honored Dr. Jaisohn by awarding him posthumously the Republic of Korea Medal in recognition of Jaisohn's contribution to to national foundation. His remains were repatriated to the National Cemetery in 1994. His lifelong dedication to progressive reform, modernization, independence, and democracy was highly appreciated. Dr. Philip Jaisohn lived an extraordinary life replete with dramatic events. He was a great advocate and champion of modernity, independence, and democracy, and his spirit contributed to the recent democratization of Korean society. Dr. Philip Jaisohn's noble life left an indelible mark on our history.
한 집안으로 4천년을 살아왔는데 왜 지금 나누어서 두 집이 될 까닭이 있습니까? 둘이 되면 둘이 다 약해지고 살 수가 없을 때 한 배 속에 든 것 같아서 한쪽 배가 무너지면 저쪽도 엉망해지는 법이야. 나는 소련 미국이더라도 내 정신은 조선 사람들과 같이 있으니 아무쪼록 합심하고 합동해서 조선을 살게 해주시기를 나는 간절히 바라고 있습니다.
What a moving video presentation. It really captured Philip Jaisohn's remarkable contribution to the quest for freedom. His history is storied among Koreans throughout the world. We now welcome Mr. John-Hak Hong for a presentation from New York. Mr. Hong is a successful businessman and was the president of the Korean American Association of Queens, New York. Welcome, Mr. Hong.
예, 저는 뉴욕의 박정희 기념사업회 홍종학 회장입니다. 오늘 올해가 3.1 운동이 일어난 103주년 해가 되는데요. 그래서 다시 우리가 옛날 이 선열들의 그 3.1 운동의 업적을 되새겨보고 합니다. 우리가 뉴욕에서 사실 뉴욕이 모든 행사의 그 중심지가 되어가지고 그러니까 이런 여러 가지 단체들이 활동도 하고 하는 이 중심지입니다. 2019년에 3.1 운동 100주년 행사라고 해서 허라싱에서 가장 큰 그 연회장 대동 연회장에서 100주년 행사를 할 때 저도 그러니까 연사로 참석해서 이야기를 한 기억이 납니다. 그래서 뉴욕에는 두 단체 박정희 기념사업회 그리고 이승만 박사 뉴욕 기념사업회가 둘이가 건국 대통령 그다음에 나라를 부강하게 만든 박정희 대통령이 두 톱니바퀴가 항상 행사를 하고 여러 가지 구국 운동도 하고 태극기 데모도 하고 이렇게 해오고 있습니다. 그래서 지난 19년에 또 특이할 만한 거는 뉴욕주 상하원에서 3.1 운동 100주년 그러니까 선포 결의안을 만장일치를 통과하고 그러니까 여러 가지 주의회에서도 3.1절 행사를 했습니다. 우리 교포들이 이제 거기 올라가서 그리고 다시 옛날로 돌아가서 뉴욕이 이 3.1 운동 독립운동의 중심지가 되었다는 이야기를 제가 나누고자 합니다. 그러니까 3.1 운동이 1919년 3월 1일이지만은 그 한 2달 후에 그 4월 24일경에 뉴욕 타임스에서 대대적으로 3.1 운동을 갖다가 그러니까 기사를 했습니다. 그 당시 저 신문 기사는 제가 보지는 못했지만은 기록에 하면은 전면 그 페이지에다가 한국의 그 3.1 운동사를 갖다가 하고 그러니까 한국이 그냥 일제에 그냥 순종해서 하는 나라가 아니고 나타나서 그러니까 국민의 그 독립 정신 그리고 이 세계 만방에 우리가 일제 압박에 있다는 것을 알리고 했던 그러한 그러니까 숭고한 정신을 상당히 그 뉴욕 타임스에서는 알렸다고 기록에 남아 있습니다. 그런데 이 3.1 운동이 일어나고 난 이후에 뉴욕, 그 2년 후에 뉴욕에서 큰 행사가 있었어요. 만하탄 그 타임스퀘어 바로 옆에 1900, 그러니까 43가에 보면 그 타운홀이라고 있어요. 그 타운홀에서 일종의 그러니까 3.1절 그러니까 2주년 행사를 시작할 때 상당히 그 당시 유학을 온 유학생들이 한 100여 명이, 100여 명이라면 그 당시 그러니까 다 모인 셈이죠. 모이고 그다음에 미국 사람들도 대거 참석해서 한 1,300명이 참석을 해서 그 타운홀에서 행사를 할 때 우리가 알고 있는 독립운동가 𝗂𝗵𝗵 박사가 사회를 하고 그다음에 정항정 씨가 그 독립운동가가 그러니까 키노트 연설을 하고 이래서 행사를 한 거가 기록에 남아 있습니다. 근데 이 행사가 단지 행사로 끝난 게 아니고 그 100여 명의 유학생들이 모여가지고 우리가 한국의 3.1 정신을 이어받아 독립운동을 계속해 가자 이렇게 해서 뭉치게 됩니다. 이 3.1 운동 2주년 행사 때 이 뭉쳤을 때 그 당시 이제 여러 가지 이승만 박사도 물론 그 위에 있지만 그 독립운동가 조병옥 박사라든가 그 유학생들이 모여가지고 그 독립운동을 할 수 있는 모임 장소를 갖다가 마련하자 이래갖고 만하탄의 콜롬비아 대학 115가 서쪽이죠. 허드슨 강변이 보이는. 근데 그때 조병옥 박사가 그 박사학위 콜롬비아 대학에서 공부를 하고 있을 때니까 그 부근에 이제 물색을 해서 그러니까 건물을 구입합니다. 그 건물이 4층짜리 건물이고 지하가 1층이 있는데 미국 주인도 한국의 독립운동 유학생들의 거기다가 아주 헌신적으로 싸게 팔고 구입을 해서 그것이 뉴욕 한인교회인데 지금도 아주 그 교회가 운영이 되고 남아 있습니다. 그래서 그 3.1 운동을 기하를 해서 한국의 만국의 한을 달래던 유학생들이 독립운동을 계속해서 이어가고 그 다음에 건물을 구입해서 거기서 계속 모임을 갖습니다. 가져가지고 교회는 물론 하겠지만은 그 종교를 넘어서서 한인교회를 넘어서서 여기서 이제 그러니까 독립운동의 산실로 그러니까 이게 모임을 갖게 됩니다. 근데 옛날 제가 이제 신문이나 기록에 보면 거기에 여러 가지 한국에서 초대 나라를 세우던 많은 사람들이 여기에 얼굴이 보입니다. 물론 이승만 박사로부터 조병옥 박사, 임병직 씨, 여러 가지 많은 사람들이 거기 모여서 유학생들이 모여가지고 예배도 보고 그 다음에 한국의 독립운동에 대해서 어떻게 하겠느냐 하고 합니다. 그런데 단지 이야기만 하는 게 아니고 여러 가지 독립운동에 대한 신문 그러니까 학생회보 그 다음에 자유한국이라는 신문, 그다음에 3일 신보, 그 우라키라 말은 록피 산맥 할 때 𝘊𝘆ci𝗴𝗵𝗆 록피인데 R 발음을 못 하니까 그래서 우라키라고 록피라고 하는 신문도 만들고 그래서 계속해서 이 독립운동을 갖다가 이어가고 있습니다. 그래서 여기에 이제 학생들이 안 그래도 한국의 3.1 운동을 통해서 연락을 받고 또 그걸로 통해서 망명을 오고 또 독립운동을 하고 하면서 한국의 그러니까 3.1 운동에 대해서 돕기도 하겠지만은 나라를 잃은 슬픔을 허드슨강을 쳐다보면서 거기서 많은 각종 출판물을 통하고 또 여러 가지 랠리를 하고 이렇게 해서 이어나가고 있습니다. 저도 여러 교회를 들리게 되는데 어떤 행사가 있기도 하고 또 옛날에 대륙 마라톤 강조를 해서 거기 모일 때 그거를 우리가 만남의 장소로 해서 들리기도 하고 장추로 목사님을 또 알기 때문에 가끔 들리기도 하고 옛날 이야기들을 들었는데 장추로 목사님은 우리 독립사라든가 한인사회의 자료를 많이 알고 또 거기에 대해서 돕는 사람이었어요. 그래서 가서 듣기도 했는데 제가 지하실을 가보게 된다고. 그 지하실을 가면은 옛날 독립운동 때 했던 사진들이 남아 있는데 그 지하실에 피아노가 한 대가 있어요. 그러니까 거기 유명한 작곡가 안익태 선생님이 그러니까 애국가를 작곡을 하던 피아노라 그래요. 그래서 하도 신기해서 내가 뚜껑을 열어보고 그 피아노를 눌려봤다. 그러니까 상당히 소리가 잘 나고 뭐 골동품까지는 아니더라고. 그래서 하고 있습니다. 근데 이제 지금은 거기 그 건물을 한국 정부의 후원으로 그러니까 공사를 하고 있어요. 공사를 하는데 원형은 앞모양은 그대로 보존을 하고 내부는 그러니까 옛날에 그러니까 독립운동의 역사성을 보존하기 위해서 원형을 그대로 보존하면서 내부를 공사를 하고 있는데 만약 이 공사가 끝나게 되면은 한국 역사 그러니까 독립기념관으로 탈바꿈을 하게 될 겁니다. 그래서 참 이제 100년이 지난 지금에 와서 우리 옛날 선조들이 독립운동, 3.1 운동을 시작해서 독립운동을 하던 역사 교육의 현장으로 유지하고 발전될 거리라고 보고 있습니다. 또 한인들도 거기에 협조를 해서 헌금을 하고 이래서 좀 있으면 이제 공사가 끝나면 단장을 하게 되면 개관을 하게 되면은 많은 우리 교포 2세들이 견학을 가고 방문도 가고 하게 될 거로 알고 있습니다. 예, 그래서 해마다 100년 전에, 여 년 전에 일어나던 해마다 행사를 해왔고 계속해서 뉴욕이라도 우리 교포들이 한인회를 중심하고 여러 가지 단체를 중심해서 3.1 운동 행사를 계속 해오고 있습니다. 물론 올해도 3.1 운동 그러니까 기념 행사를 만하탄 한인회를 중심으로서 하게 될 겁니다. 예, 그래서 103주년을 맞아서 우리 선조들의 3.1 운동에 대한 뉴욕을 중심으로 한 그 내용을 제가 기리면서 앞으로 우리가 계속해서 다음 우리 1.5세나 2세들에게 3.1 운동 정신이 우리의 독립 정신뿐만 아니고 나라 발전의 계기가 되는 그러니까 하나의 버팀목으로 나아가게 될 것을 기대하면서 짤막하게 제가 이야기를 마치겠습니다. 예, 감사합니다.
Thank you, Mr. Hong. Your presentation on the significant contribution made by Korean Americans related to the Samil movement in New York was very insightful. That concludes the first part of our program. We hope you gain new perspectives on the history of the Samil movement. We will now move into the second part of our program today. We'll invite two experts to provide commentaries on the presentation we just heard.
Good afternoon. My name is Seo-hyun Lee. I am a North Korean defector from Pyongyang, now living in the US. I'm working for American NGOs for North Korean human rights and running a YouTube channel, Pyonghattan, to inform the international society with the uncensored truth about North Korea and to bring awareness of North Korean human rights abuses. It's my honor to make this comment for the Samil commemoration event today. Growing up and having education in North Korea, which distorts or even makes up history for the ruling dictator's convenience, my understanding of the Samil independence movement was quite different from most of you here today. North Korea teaches about the Samil independence movement in schools. However, almost every detail is focused on promoting the greatness of the dictator Kim Il-sung or his family members. For example, North Koreans don't even quite know about Yoo Gun-sun, a 17-year-old female student at 𝗓𝘓 school at the time and died in Seodaemun prison for saying "Long live the independence" in public. North Korean textbooks only emphasize that Kim Il-sung participated in the Samil independence movement with his grandparents at age of 7, waving a flag all the way from Mangyongdae to the downtown of Pyongyang City. In addition, the Kim regime disparages it as a failed movement which caused many victims by not having the right strategy or leadership. In a nutshell, the Samil independence movement was distorted by the North Korean regime, and the effort of people who fought for Korea's independence are not well known to North Korean people. And I had no idea at all that so many Korean Americans fought for Korean independence here in America. I have learned the true history only after I left North Korea and when I found out about the efforts of Korean Americans to liberate their motherland. I was so deeply impressed and motivated. Now, the priority of the international society is on Ukraine crisis. However, we must remember the 25 million people who are currently suffering from the most oppressive regime in the world without basic human rights or access to the necessities to live. You should be aware that the current threat of North Korea with its nuclear weapons could turn into real big problem if we don't fix it in time. As my last comment, I want to talk to Korean Americans about that. If there were no efforts of our Korean American ancestors to get back the Korean independence, you would have been born and raised as one of the totalitarian country's citizens and never ever have had the chance to enjoy your freedom and rights you have here in America now. This is why we should remember history, learn the spirits of our Korean Americans, and join the movement of freeing and reunifying the two Koreas. I have here a very famous and applicable quote for you all. There is no bright future for a nation that has forgotten its history. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all our participants online with us today and to all our presenters. First of all, I'd like to offer my heartfelt thanks to Professor Cha, Dr. Che, and Mr. Hong for their informative and illuminating presentations. They really highlighted the crucial role of Koreans in America in promoting Korean independence. As Professor Cha said, it's important for Korean Americans to know their history as it is part of their identity. But our gathering, our forum today, is not simply about honoring the past and recognizing noble characters and their aspirations. It also is a time to look back to the past in order to look forward. The Samil movement hoped for a Korea that was, quote, united, independent, and free. And the new United Nations, right after the Second World War, echoed that sentiment and said that Korea should be a country that is united, independent, and free. That Korea has still not been achieved, as we feel all too painfully, and especially Korean people, whether in Korea or in the diaspora. Korea today is not united, it is not free, and how can a divided people be truly independent? So I'd like to make a few points related to what our presenters have said and also to the overall situation. First of all, many people, especially Americans, think of Korea in terms of the Korean War and the connection that was formed between the US and Korea through the Korean War and defense of Korea by US forces together with other nations in the United Nations forces. But the connection between America and Korea long predates the war. It actually goes back to the closing decades of the 19th century when Christian missionaries were very active in Korea and had a tremendous influence on many young Koreans who wanted to see change in their society to a more just, free, democratic type of society. So there are missionaries such as Horace Underwood, Henry Appenzeller, the Methodist, who founded a school in 1886 called the 𝗵𝗺 Mission School. And at that school, some of the people we've heard about today were either teachers or students. Philip Jaisohn, 𝘒𝗰𝗵𝗆, was a teacher at the 𝗵𝗺 Mission School, and among his students was Syngman Rhee. So these missionaries had a tremendous influence, not just in religious terms, in terms of personal spiritual life, but the 𝗵𝗺 School was really created as a nation-building institution in order to raise future leaders. And it succeeded because key future leaders came out of that school. In moving to the Samil movement itself and the response in America, in April 1919, right after the Samil demonstrations had begun in Korea, just the following month, there was a Korean National Congress held in Philadelphia, organized by Philip Jaisohn at Constitution Hall. So there was a very clear intention there to link the desire for Korean independence and the principles on which it would stand with the American founding and American independence and the principles embodied particularly in the Declaration of Independence, stating that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. The Korean Americans such as Philip Jaisohn took this as an inspiration and something they wanted to see implemented in their own country. On that foundation, there was a significant outreach by Korean Americans, groups and organizations to the US Congress, the legislature, the executive, and to civil society. So churches, pastors, also educators, teachers, and professional people, businessmen, were all contacted and connected with this movement for Korean independence and had great sympathy and support for it. So that's one point I want that there's a deep connection between the U.S. and Korea and Koreans going back to the late 19th century, and rooted in principles and ideals. Second thing I want to say is the importance of unity in striving for a united Korea. At the Korean National Congress in Philadelphia in 1919, there were 27 different Korean organizations in America that came together, joined together, and supported the reading of the declaration of the Korean Declaration of Independence and the subsequent appeal to America that was written and distributed around the country. So they all came together with one ideal and one purpose. Really, 1922 was the high watermark of that type of unity. Later, divisions arose, and even though the leaders of different organizations recognized that this hampered their work, they couldn't overcome them and create a united front and effort. And that really only came about with the onset of World War II. So the importance there is the point I want to make there is the importance of a united purpose and ideal that different organizations can come together to support. The third thing, and closing, is I want to talk about the need for a vision and for guiding principles. Partly the leaders we've heard about today caught a vision from the American founding ideals through the Christian missionaries who came to Korea and through their study in America, 𝘒𝘂𝑚an Lee, Philip Jaisohn, and Chang-ho. They were very much taken by American ideals from the Declaration of Independence. But also the Samil movement itself and the words of the Korean Declaration of Independence had a vision that drew on Korean history and the spirit of 𝘠𝘰𝘰𝘵, the 𝘠𝘰𝘰𝘵 tradition. So their goal was not only to be free of Japanese rule, to be an independent country, but they had a vision beyond that of actually being able to cooperate with Japan and China to create an ideal East Asian society of high ideals that would be of benefit to the world. And that type of idea is reflected in the words of Kim Gu, one of the leaders in the independence movement who did not spend a lot of time in America, some time, and was certainly influenced by American founding ideals. And he said with his vision for Korea was, I wish my nation would be a nation that doesn't just imitate others, but rather be a nation that is the source of a new and higher culture. And so true world peace would come from our nation, that's Korea. I wish peace would be achieved in our nation and from there to the world. A very high ideal and stirring vision, but one that you can see very much flows out of the 𝘠𝘰𝘰𝘵 ideal. And it's also reflected, echoed by Professor Cha in his closing remarks, where he talked about developing an identity as Koreans and Korean Americans with the idea that we can embrace everyone. To do that, he said, you have to know yourself first, so that means you have to know your history. And then on that basis, you can extend your compassion to all people. Again, that's something that flows out of this 𝘠𝘰𝘰𝘵 tradition and spirit. So I want to close by mentioning a timely contemporary vision for a free and united Korea, namely the Korean dream, that is an idea, a vision advanced by Dr. Hyunjin Preston Moon. In it, he draws on Korea's spiritual and cultural roots, especially the 𝘠𝘰𝘰𝘵 tradition. And this approach far transcends the economic, political, and ideological issues that have dominated discussion and political reality in the last 75 years of the divided Korea. And I'd like to conclude finally by suggesting how this approach might be not only a foundation for the reunification of the Korean people, the separated Korean people, but that it could have a global significance. In our current world, we face the challenge of conflicts, identity-based conflicts, and greater fragmentation without an overarching ideal. Ultimately, I believe want to propose the antidote to such groups that are pursuing identity-based goals in a violent manner. The antidote must be a transcendent vision of humanity as one family, united under a common roof of universal principles and values, values and principles shared by all the great spiritual and ethical traditions. You might call that one family under God. That vision in turn must give rise to a global ethic that must be expressed in the moral practice of communities, societies, and nations, as well as in the relations between nations. And I want to suggest that Korea can make a major practical contribution to the emergence of such a global ethic if it creates a national vision based on 𝗤𝗥 인간, and on that basis reunites the Korean people of the North and the South. Such an achievement would resolve the major obstacle to peace and prosperous development in Northeast Asia, with positive implications for the rest of the world. As a result, Korea could become an inspirational example globally and a model for peaceful development. So in the story of Dangun, 𝗤𝗥 인간 is linked closely with the principle of 𝗤𝘰𝗵𝗄, or in roughly governing the world by law. I want to suggest this is not laws enacted by the state, but universal laws that reflect universal principles. And so we can understand the two concepts, 𝗤𝗥 인간 and 𝗤𝘰𝗵𝗄, taken together as an exhortation to govern the world through laws that reflect universal principles in order to form citizens who can act for the benefit of all humanity. This is indeed a noble aspiration, and I'm sure is at the heart of the Samil independence movement leaders and people who supported and worked for that movement. And it's one that Koreans, I think, should feel proud to own and desire to make it a reality in a restored homeland. And that is a future I hope that at least some of us will live to see. Thank you.
Thank you for the illuminating commentary and unique insights. We also, again, thank all of our presenters that we heard today for giving such important historical perspectives. As a Korean American, I can personally express the pride that I carry knowing about this very rich history and my commitment to advancing the remarkable legacy of Koreans in the United States. Let us now welcome back Mr. Ritchie Lee, the Alliance for Korea United president, to bring closing remarks to this 2022 Samil commemoration on inheriting the legacy of Korean American leadership.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our 103rd Samil Commemoration virtual event. I'm sure you will join me in thanking these remarkable speakers, commentators, and partners who helped to put this historic program together. Stay in touch as we move forward together to manifest the ideas of the independence movement on the foundation of these historic pioneers. Our organization is Alliance for Korea United USA. We are a coalition advancing the cause for a unified Korea that fulfills the historic ideas and aspirations of the Korean people. We invite all Korean American individuals and organizations to join in this alliance. We are looking forward to working together with you. Thank you. And please have a meaningful Samil commemoration with your families and communities.